When a fish stops swimming forward, it's already dead. This might just capture the lifelong fate of the coelacanth. You see, I've never been a fan of calling anything a living fossil. After all, every living thing on Earth exists in a state of constant evolution, just like the eternal flow of time. But only the coelacanth seems to have stepped outside of time itself. In 1938, South African zoologist Marjorie Courtney-Latimer stumbled upon one at a local fish market. Before that, everyone believed this ancient fish had already gone completely extinct 66 million years ago. But even more astonishing than their resurrection is this fish looks virtually identical to its ancestors, as if it had swum straight out of a reconstruction. So why is that? The story begins around 420 million years ago, at the end of the Silurian and beginning of the Devonian periods. At that time, jeweled fish had just emerged and began flooding the world, announcing the arrival of kings. Among them, one group of jeweled fish was particularly formidable. That is the sarcopterygians, to which we belong. Simply put, this is a group that includes us tetrapods today, along with lungfish and coelacanths, a group of vertebrates with lobed fins. Although today these three branches of sarcopterygians may not look identical, they're at least completely different. But 420 million years ago, right when they first split apart, they still looked pretty similar to each other. For example, back then, our tetrapodomorph Canichthyes, the dipnomorph Porolepis, and the stem coelacanth Miguashaya looked like they came off the same assembly line. And these early sarcopterygians all lived pretty much the same way. They'd use their fleshy fins to crawl or swim, sneaking through the intricate seafloor, relying on their elongated paired nostrils called nares. They'd keenly sniff out small fish passing by. Then they'd lunge forward, jaws flaring open to suck prey straight in, before clamping down with sharp, densely packed teeth, holding on until their victim exhausted itself to death. This was essentially an unbeatable anti-fish weapon at the time. Thanks to abundant acanthodians and other small fish in the early Devonian, the Sarcopterygian family enjoyed its first great flourishing. But what heaven grants in abundance, heaven will also take away. As jawed fish groups rose to power, the oceans became increasingly crowded. Food quickly became scarce, and even the Sarcopterygians themselves gradually became prey for others. As a result, most Sarcopterygians went extinct in a very short time, and the survivors had no choice but to seek new ways forward. Eventually, two groups of Sarcopterygians chose to swim toward distant frontiers, heading for the unpredictable freshwater rivers and the unknown dark continent. These Sarcopterygians later evolved into us tetrapods and the lungfish. However, at this time, another group of Sarcopterygians turned and swam toward the ocean depths, deciding, I will hold my ground here. This is our ancestors' homeland, I won't just hand it over. So from the early Devonian, 410 million years ago, a group of early coelacanths, represented by Euprosteas from Yunnan, embarked on this uncompromising evolutionary path. To survive in this perilous new era, they had to master their ancestral traits to become stronger and stronger. Perhaps to avoid the edge of competitors, they had to retreat into the most rugged seafloor terrain, darting and weaving. They evolved a unique three-lobed tail. This way, the upper, middle, and lower lobes could each beat independently. Paired with the more robust fleshy-lobed dorsal and anal fins, they could fine-tune their thrust direction with exquisite precision, at the same time to ensure such a tail could still deliver enough power when needed. They greatly strengthened their notochord. That's right, early bony fish had no bony vertebrae. Their central axis consisted only of a flexible notochord. To make this notochord more elastic, it had to become more robust. They even reduced the size of their spinal cord and even their brain to make room for the notochord. This unusually robust notochord also prevented them from later evolving true vertebrae to replace the notochord, which is why their descendants' fossils often give the impression that between the fish bones on the upper and lower sides, there's a gap, or in other words, where vertebrae should be, appears to be a hollow cavity, hence the name coelacanth. But that's not all. To further enhance their suction feeding abilities, they also greatly strengthened their intracranial joint. Simply put, in the very beginning, we used to have a joint on the top of our skull that could lift our entire face. Like Iron Man's armor, tilting it up slightly. This allowed us to open our mouths wider when gulping prey, but we tetrapods and lungfish lost this joint after our ancestors abandoned that lifestyle. Coelacanths, on the other hand, greatly enhanced the flexibility of this joint, maxing out the suction power of sarcopterygians. Building on this, they reduced most of their upper jaw bones, keeping only a small toothed premaxilla at the very front of the upper jaw. Combined with its epically enhanced jaw muscles, this allows it to concentrate force at a single point when biting prey. No armor can withstand its piercing strike. Thus, a sarcopterygian perfected to the extreme emerged from the crevices of shallow reef rocks. In the late Devonian, about 380 million years ago, coelacanths like Mawsonia looked almost the same as modern coelacanths, were already virtually identical to modern coelacanths. But this wasn't their final form. To adapt to various crevices on the ocean floor, coelacanths evolved into various forms, like eel-shaped ones suited for burrowing, and pomfret-shaped ones that could navigate through narrow crevices. Meanwhile, the placoderms that once occupied the habitats of sarcopterygians rapidly declined after the end Devonian mass extinction, leaving the seas empty once again. So, in less than 30 million years, starting about 360 million years ago, coelacanth species diversity more than tripled. An ancient sarcopterygian kingdom seemed poised to rise again on the seabed. But at this very moment, an unexpected enemy suddenly struck. They were called cartilaginous fish. Maybe coelacanths could never have imagined that these little fish that once trembled before them would suddenly rise to power after the end Devonian mass extinction and display truly terrifying evolutionary potential. Although these cartilaginous fish rarely left fossils, leaving us with little knowledge of them to this day, just from the 2 fossil sites of Bear Gulch and Mason Creek in the United States alone. The diverse array of cartilaginous fish unearthed there speaks volumes. Yes, the same ones I rattled off in my previous episodes. And beneath this parade of cartilaginous fish lies the shattered realm of the coelacanths. Once again, they retreated back into the cramped crevices of shallow seas. Finally, around 330 million years ago, global cooling occurred in the mid-Carboniferous. Vast shallow seas disappeared, taking with them over 80% of coelacanth groups, directly causing the coelacanths 30 million years of painstakingly accumulated diversity to be reset to zero once more, leaving only a handful of relics virtually indistinguishable from their Devonian ancestors to continue eking out an existence in the coelacanth's sole viable ecological niche. Yet fate still granted the coelacanth a second chance. Around 250 million years ago, the Siberian traps erupted with catastrophic force. The world witnessed the end Permian mass extinction that emptied the seas. Yet this catastrophe that completely destroyed the cartilaginous fish empire miraculously spared the coelacanths hiding in the shadows. At the time, nearly all major coelacanth groups had some lineages that survived the mass extinction, and when they returned to the now empty sunlit waters, the most radical transformation in coelacanth history began. On the seafloor, as animal activity vanished, vast algae blooms and other small benthic organisms began flourishing, so some coelacanths unceremoniously hit rock bottom, using their powerful bite force to feed on sessile organisms on the seafloor, such as Rhabdoderma and Phorea. They also represent the only time in coelacanth's evolutionary history of a major overhaul of their skull structure. Some coelacanths even made a decision that went against their ancestors, namely the rebel coelacanths. They evolved exceptionally developed tail fins and streamlined bodies, reaching body lengths of over 1 meter, boldly venturing into the upper open waters their ancestors had avoided, marking the first time the coelacanth family became fast-swimming predators. In its wake, the entire coelacanth family reached the peak of species diversity in their history. Unfortunately, this peak lasted barely a million years. Then reality ruthlessly burst their bubble. And this time, emerging from the Triassic seas was a group of even more formidable opponents, Actinopterygii, the most common fish we see today. Perhaps once upon a time, they were merely prey for coelacanths, but somehow, after surviving the mass extinction, they emerged transformed. These fish had lighter, more durable membranous fins, compared to the coelacanth's clunky lobed fins, more agile and better adapted to complex terrain. They evolved a protrusile upper jaw, not only giving them stronger suction power, but also allowing their mouths to launch forward to extend their reach. In an instant, everything the coelacanth took pride in became a joke. Their diversity was knocked right back to square one. When they came to their senses, they realized they couldn't even hold on to their ancestral refuge, those shallow water crevices anymore. And at that point, the coelacanths were left with only one path, a universally acknowledged point of no return in Funstuff's video: getting bigger. Only these last coelacanths could rely on brute force stat stacking to carve out a niche on the ocean floor. As they gradually left the crevices, their bodies became more rotund. Meanwhile, to power their increasingly massive frames, these coelacanths' fleshy fins grew longer and more robust. They even added some bony plates around the notochord for reinforcement, so it finally began to resemble something of a vertebral column. At the same time, they elongated their faces somewhat, maximized mouth capacity to strengthen suction power. In addition, since they now had to make long treks along the seafloor, they inevitably faced sudden changes in water pressure. But 10,000 years of living in tight crevices meant they hadn't even evolved ribs by that point. So to maintain the shape of their swim bladder, these coelacanths simply coated their swim bladders with numerous bony plates, forming an ossified swim bladder, making them one of the few animals whose bladders could fossilize. This was all they could do for this ancient body in desperate straits. At this point, the coelacanth as we know it had basically taken shape. These last descendants of the coelacanth lineage were named Latimerioidae by scholars. They swam toward the final twilight of the coelacanth family, as if by some strange twist of fate. The branch most obsessed with growing larger followed the very route once taken by the ancestors of lungfish and tetrapods, swimming upstream from estuaries into freshwater rivers. By then, there was no longer any trace of tetrapodomorph sarcopterygians there. In their place, only their descendants remained giant dinosaurs like Spinosaurus. And it was here that the coelacanth family reached its peak in size. The giant Morsonia, which could reach lengths of over 5 meters, as if to tell its former king, "See, I could have made it too." Then 66 million years ago, the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs also forever erased the coelacanth's last glory. From then on, coelacanth fossils vanished from the fossil record until 1938, when people discovered by chance that their descendants had survived to this day, named Latimeria after its discoverer. The one genus and 2 species of coelacanths that survive today both belong to the Latimerioidae. They are all found in the deep waters of the Indian Ocean. Compared to their ancestors from the age of dinosaurs, today's coelacanths, to withstand enormous water pressure, have almost completely lost their signature ossified swim bladder, relying instead on a thick deposit of visceral fat to regulate body density. Despite reaching nearly 3 feet in length, these coelacanths still prefer rugged rocky reefs, using their lobed fins to wedge themselves into crevices. Perhaps the ancestors of today's coelacanths survived by taking refuge in such deep-sea sanctuaries. Combined with their century-long lifespan, they managed to survive that catastrophic collision. But this also meant that, compared to Morsonia, they had to retract their elongated snouts and lobed fins to fit into crevices, bringing their appearance full circle back to the beginning. Perhaps, at that moment, the coelacanths finally accepted their fate.